Mark Kramer, the Director of Cold War Studies here at Harvard University and the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. I want to welcome everyone to today's seminar, which is marking the 70th anniversary of one of the most joyous events of the 20th century, which was the death of Joseph Stalin. The precise anniversary is this coming Sunday. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953. Stalin, at the time he died, he was only a few years older than Vladimir Putin is now. But inevitably, because of the war this year, there are parallels that people are looking back on. We're going to discuss both Stalin's role in the Soviet Union and some of the legacy of his time in office and his death. So let me briefly introduce each of the participants. Nina Tumarkin is a professor of history at Wellesley College and an associate of the Davis Center for, and also a former director of Russia programs at Wellesley College. Norman Neymark is a professor of history professor of East European history at Stanford University, a former director of the Russian and East European and Central Asia program there, and it also has been involved in other institutes at Stanford. And then George Soroka, who is a colleague of mine at Harvard and has been doing a great deal of work on assessing the legacy of Stalin in current day Russia. Hiroaki Kuramiya, professor emeritus at Indiana University, was also supposed to be taking part. Unfortunately, an illness prevented him. He contacted me this morning to let me know, and I hope we can schedule him for another event later this spring. But I'll fill in for him. I do want to start the seminar briefly by showing a couple of things. This will be first a photo that was shown in Washington, D.C. at the time, at the 1203 restaurant, which I believe still exists on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's 1203. This reflected the sentiment that many felt at the time, certainly not maybe in the Kremlin, but elsewhere. But it wasn't a universal sentiment. Certainly within the Soviet Union, there were many people who genuinely cried at Stalin's death. And that includes even in the Gulag, as we know from the memoirs of people who were interned in the Gulag, that even in the Gulag, when they heard about Stalin's death, there was certainly a great deal of rejoicing, but there were some people who actually cried. So that I also want to show a video, a couple of quick clips from videos. One of these is Stalin's final public speech, which, whoops. God, I need to stop that. Hang on just one second. Okay, it's clicked. So this is Stalin appearing at the 19th Party Congress of the Communist Party in October 1952. This was his last public speech, or at least major public appearance. And you can see in this video how much he had aged. He wasn't all that old. He was only in his early 70s, but you can see it that certainly his time in office had taken a toll on him.
The video is not done.
Товарищи, разрешите выразить благодарность от имени нашего съезда всем братским партиям и группам, представители которых почтили наш съезд своим присутствием, и которые прислали съезду приветственные обращения. выразить благодарность за братские приветствия, за пожелания успеха, за доверие.
So this will give you some sense of Stalin. Stalin at the time was had clearly aged during the war and in the years after, and so even though he wasn't all that old when he died, he certainly showed someone who was in his final months or maybe a final couple of years. And then I just want to show a brief clip from the time of his funeral, the actual funeral. So just bear with me for a second because Zoom made it inordinately difficult to share things now. Okay.
Провел комиссию контрольную, комиссию закрыть. Просто непонятно.
So Stalin will be lying in state here, and then I'll end this clip and turn to Norman. And he lay in state there, and vast numbers of people came through. So let me end this. Okay, with that, let me turn to Norman Neymark, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation. Nice to see you all on this joyous occasion. And I was reminded when I saw the clip of Stalin speaking at the 19th Party Congress, you know, I'm sort of an old guy myself. And after I finish a lecture, sometimes I think of the statement that he made after he sort of finished his speech and everybody was standing and clapping and wildly applauding Stalin. He went back to his comrades and he said, "See, I can still do it." It reminded me of that a little bit. Let's see if I can still do it. Anyway, I took on my task today. I wasn't really given a specific one, so I took on the task today of thinking about Putin and Stalin as reflections of each other. You know, history. We learn from history, meaning we learn from Stalin's reign about Putin, but we also learn from Putin's reign about Stalin, and in comparing the two. That's what I'm going to try to do today very quickly, and I promise to keep to my 15 minutes. And unlike Stalin, I will leave the stage on time. I confess I have resisted this comparison for a very long time. I mean, part of it is that living in Putin's Russia, you know, pre-war Putin's Russia, you know, talking to friends freely on the street, in cafes and restaurants, working in the archives unimpeded, or mostly unimpeded, you know, visiting various parts of the Russian Federation without any trouble, seeing that people were more or less content with their lives. They were able to travel. They were able to come here. My friends came here. I went there. You know, it just seemed like a stretch to compare the two. Part of it too is watching Putin in action, you know, on in interviews, you know, and speeches, also in person once at this Valdai meeting I went to. I was pretty impressed, I have to say, by the fact that he could speak so well, that he could answer questions spontaneously. It was a controlled session, but still was pretty, 2 hours open. His ability to articulate issues and to answer questions. Stalin, we know, was a very smart and able man. But I was extremely impressed, by Putin's ability to communicate directly with an audience, without a lot of intervening stuff. The flip side of it is that Stalin's Russia, as we know, was an awful, terrible, fearful place. It was a place where people lived in fear of being arrested, in fear of saying something wrong, in fear of people reporting on them. Millions, as we know, were arrested, interrogated, tortured, taken off to the Gulag, shot. This kind of the sheer weight of Stalin's Russia on the back of the Russian people, was so difficult and so terrifying that it was hard for me in some ways then to compare the two. Putin, we know, was an autocrat, a growing autocrat, but still, it was a very different kind of place that he ruled. So I just felt that, that comparing the two, a little bit like the comparison to fascism too, at one point, which was very, au courant, just didn't work. And that they were very different kinds of people. As the war has progressed, and when you invited me to do this, I became more convinced, actually, that they had many similar characteristics. Let's think about them as leaders at war. True, Putin doesn't wear a military uniform or pose as a generalissimo, but nevertheless, they both project powerful images of being under control and being in control, even when they might not be. They project this image of knowing what they're doing, even when they sometimes don't, and of leading their respective armies and honoring the service of their military subordinates. They both routinely replace generals who do not produce the results they want, and blame other generals, for the insufficiencies that they themselves may be responsible for. Putin's injunctions to the military, what was it, a week ago at Luzhniki, standing in front of the crowd saying, hurrah, 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 reminded me a little bit of Stalin's own wartime appearances before the people and the troops. Although it was much more, gaudy and I guess 21st century than what Stalin would do. The motifs of sacrifice for the fatherland, the honor of shedding blood for the greater good of the Russian people looms large with both of them. That Putin put up that statue of Stalin in Volgograd for the anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad and renamed the city of Stalingrad for a day, praised the great military leader once again, should be seen as significant. At the same time, he said at the same time, if the people of Volgograd want the town renamed, I'll rename it, but they didn't want that. And so, he's ready. He's moving, it seems to me, more in the direction of accepting totally the Stalin, as a worthwhile predecessor. I recall also at the opening of the memorial of the victims of terror that Putin didn't even mention Stalin's name. In other words, now in his historical, in quotes, analyses, he basically looks at the Bolsheviks as the problem, not so much at Stalin himself. And of course, Stalin's the victory of the symbol of the victory of the war. And Stalin is also a symbol of Gosdarstvenность, the state, attention to the powerful state. Also in his wartime behavior, Putin is in some senses mimicking Stalin by using a lot of the non-Russian peoples of the Russian Federation. In this case of the Soviet Union, in Stalin's case, to serve as a kind of cannon fodder for the war. I mean, he spends, this sort of lack of interest in minimizing casualties is also something that's very Stalin-esque. I mean, shoving people into the war, raw recruits who are not ready to be fighting, and the kind of even the way of war, the heavy use of tank columns and the way tanks are being used in the war. Also, there was a report this morning in the Times, not very effectively, is another piece of the story, which could be followed in greater detail. War crimes and crimes of humanity, crimes against humanity that are committed by Russian troops in Ukraine today, we're seen in the Soviet advances against the Germans in Eastern Europe and in Germany, and by the way, against other peoples of Eastern Europe as well. No one felt much sympathy for the Germans at the time, of course, but it's worth remembering that hundreds of thousands, or perhaps more, of German women were raped and innocent civilians attacked and murdered as they tried to escape their homes. You see the same kind of pillaging, the same kind of wanton destruction, stealing drink, a variety of household goods, all that's been widely reported from Ukraine as well. Now, that isn't necessarily, the result of orders from Stalin and from Putin, but we do know that they set the tone for the war, and that they, for both of these wars, and that they, could prevent it if they wanted. I mean, this was, or at least prevent a lot of the difficulties if they wanted. Neither Stalin nor Putin invented what we call military patriotic education in the case of both, but they both appeal to its tenets, and they both, try to sort of exemplify its major characteristics. The martial bearing. I mean, with Putin especially, we've had a lot of that. The nationalism, the patriotism, or the faux patriotism. Athletic prowess in the case of Putin. I don't think Stalin tried to pose as an athlete, and so on. That promoting military values among Russian youth in a very direct and uncomplicated way, and it works in some senses. In other words, the young people are marching around and learning to use guns and becoming good Russian military fodder for future generations. The general population too are meant to be inculcated into these values, but for the youth in particular are the object of this intense training. A further piece of the Stalin-Putin story is how they think about the Soviet-Russian Empire and Ukraine. They both adhere to the proposition, subconsciously or consciously, that Ukraine is integral to the empire. In other words, they understand instinctively that you don't have an empire without Ukraine and Russia together. From both of their viewpoints, Stalin and Putin, Ukraine is the little brother. It's little Russia. And when you get right down to it, in both cases, Russians are superior to Ukrainians. It's not said quite in those terms, but I think both for Stalin and for Putin, this is the case. They're bigger, they're stronger, they're better, they're more powerful, They're more central to the imperial project, although the Ukrainians are necessary. But the Ukrainians, are definitely junior partners from the Russian point of view. At the same time, the Ukrainians pose a danger to the Russians, precisely because they're not Russian and they don't want to be Russian. And especially, after the forcible incorporation of Western Ukraine in 1945, after having been incorporated already in 39 to 41, there's an inevitable pull towards the West in Ukraine. Even in the period of the Holodomor, the death famine, which we're also celebrating an anniversary of this year, the 90th anniversary, Stalin was constantly fearful that the Poles would use Ukrainians to destroy the Soviet Union and to bring it down. And Putin now claims that the Ukrainians are being controlled by the West for the purposes of pulling down the Russian Federation. Both Putin and Stalin have similar historical views of Ukrainians. Kievan Rus, of course, was Russian, not Ukrainian. The Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654 demonstrated the readiness of the Russians to defend the Ukrainians against the Poles, not an agreement between two equals as the Ukrainians see it. And for both Stalin and for Putin, the Holodomor was not genocide at all. Stalin denied the existence of a famine, all-Union famine period, would admit there was a famine, wouldn't allow any relief to come in, while Putin admits there was a famine, and his historians will admit there was a famine, but no special problems in Ukraine. So for both Stalin and Putin, World War II was above all a victory of the great Russian people. Yes, Ukrainians fought and fought bravely, but there were also too many Banderites, the people who were sort of followers of Stefan Bandera. God forbid, the Russians should mention the Russian volunteer army, Vlasov's people. And this diminishes then, the role of the Ukrainians during the war. Now, I see I only have 2 more minutes, so I'm going to do this really, really fast. And I'm sure my colleagues will talk about some of this too. It's worth noting that the biographies of Stalin and Putin have some eerie similarities to them. They come from poor families. I'm going to do this really fast. They came from poor families, the hard-scrabble existence. They both rose as sort of responsible bureaucrats. They outmaneuvered their opponents, and in some cases had them killed. They're intensely private people with certain, serious psychological problems. They're hard to put on the couch, but it's clear that there's paranoia and that there's fear, both in their immediate surroundings and in the situation of the world. They both heavily rely on Chekisti. I mean, this is very important that they're both, reliant in their careers on, in Stalin's case, OGPU and KVD, and in Putin's case, FSB. And, some people have suggested the FSB is acting more and more like the NKVD than like the KGB. I mean, this guy, Andrei Soldatov, has done some really good work on that. They both have fearsome phobias, but also are realists. And they still make mistakes. And the biggest mistake for Stalin, I think, was the outbreak of World War II and missing what was about to happen to the Soviet Union. And the biggest mistake of Putin, I think, was his miscalculation in the war in Ukraine. And we'll see what comes of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norman. Let me turn next to Nina. You'll have to unmute yourself, Nina. I think
right. Okay. So yes, the joyous event of Stalin's death. Like Norman, I'm kind of an old guy as well. And actually, Stalin's death was my first major political memory. I remember coming home from elementary school on the Upper West Side in New York, and suddenly finding my entire family gathered around the table, eating and drinking. And I thought, what is this? 3:00 in the afternoon, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, the whole bit. And I said, what is going on? I was a little girl. And my father pointed to the center of the table on which the New York Post was leaning against a bottle of Smirnoff vodka. And the headline said, "Stalin is dead." And they had all left work and were gathering to celebrate. And I remember saying, how can you be happy when somebody has died? And my father said, I'll tell you later. So let's talk about it now. Perhaps many people, certainly colleagues on this panel, and perhaps people in the audience, in thinking about this upcoming 70th anniversary, immediately thought of the famous poem by Yevgeny Yevtushenko, Stalin's Heirs, published in Pravda in 1962. A little quote, "I appeal to our government with the request to double, to triple the guard at this slab, so that Stalin may not rise, so that, and with Stalin the past, we rooted him out of the mausoleum, but how to root Stalin out of Stalin's heirs." To what extent is Putin Stalin's heir? Norman brilliantly has explored this question. And I thought he would. So I will talk about something else. I'll talk about the death of Stalin and his so-called afterlife, and his imprint not on Russia's political system, but on the Russian populace. I should note here that with all the similarities that Norman's talking about, Putin does not refer to himself as another Stalin, and he prefers to see himself as the heir, actually, of Peter the Great, to whom he has likened himself most recently in June in his remarks in St. Petersburg on the occasion of the 350th anniversary of Peter's birth, when he said that Peter had reclaimed what was Russia's land, even as he, Putin, is doing the same thing in Ukraine. Mark has shown clips of the funeral, talked about Stalin's death. It did lead to a kind of mass hysteria, with a country convulsed with grief. People were fearful, they felt orphaned. Even people in the Gulag were weeping, as Mark said. Even people who became major dissidents, like Lyudmila Alexeyeva, talked about having cried. 2 days later, March 7th, a decree was issued that Stalin should be embalmed and placed next to Lenin in the soon-to-be renamed Lenin-Stalin Mausoleum. Tellingly, Boris Barsky, who had supervised the embalming of Lenin in 1924, had been arrested in 1952, but he was hurriedly released just in time to embalm and mummify his successor. But the same March 7th decree stated that a grand pantheon, a kind of permanent resting place for those interred in the mausoleum, in the Kremlin, should be constructed, something like Les Invalides in Paris. It was never built. And as people know, Stalin was removed from the mausoleum in October of 1961 and buried near the Kremlin wall. Nikita Khrushchev was not really able to de-Stalinize or even get Stalin out of the mausoleum without the authority of Lenin, whom he resurrected as a cult figure in 1956. And there was the famous quote by party member Dorla Zurkina at the 22nd Party Congress, in which she said, "I always carry Ilyich in my hearts, comrades. And yesterday I took counsel with Ilyich, and he stood before me as though alive and said, 'It is unpleasant for me to lie beside Stalin, who brought such misfortune to the party.'" And that was the sort of reasoning behind getting him out of the mausoleum. And speaking of the mausoleum, certainly to communists, many communists in Russia today, Stalin is still an object of reverence. I happened to be in Moscow on January 21st, 2019, And realizing that that was the 95th anniversary of Lenin's death, I went to the mausoleum to see what the communists were up to. And I joined them. They were all carrying red carnations, and some of them had images of Lenin, some of them had images of Stalin. Somebody gave me a red carnation, and we all trooped into the mausoleum and then out of the mausoleum. And the red carnations, only a few were left at the mausoleum. All the rest of them were piled onto Stalin's grave. And this was on Lenin's death day. So if we fast forward to now and last Tuesday, gazing at the mostly affectless faces of the audience attending Putin's February 21st State of the Union address last week, I wondered, are some or even many of those faces the same as the ones that Yevgenia Ginsburg described in Journey into the Whirlwind, the dull fish eyes of her relentless interrogators in the Gulag? Did those stony visages hide the cruelty stirring in their evident support of the brutal war in Ukraine? Or did they simply reflect boredom? Of course, it's hard to say. And the next day in Luzhniki, when children from Mariupol were singing and expressing gratitude, were we looking at a repeat of "Thank you, Stalin, for our happy childhood" of the 1930s? Well, I'd say no. At least one of those children saying thank you was weeping at the same time. There's no doubt that from the beginning of Putin's presidency, Russia has experienced its second re-Stalinization, the first one being the Brezhnev era. One of Putin's first acts was to approve the issuing of medals, I think 500 of them, with Stalin's image, also a bust of Stalin in the Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow, that as of 2017 became called the Museum of the Victory. Most telling is the rapid rise of the popular approval of Stalin in opinion polls. Since 1989, people have been asked about who is the most outstanding Lichnost, personage of all times and peoples. And after Putin's accession to the presidency, Stalin rose rapidly in these rankings, and since 2012 became and remains ranked as the greatest person of all times and peoples. Most recently in May 1921, with the same question of the greatest person of all times and peoples, Stalin was first with 39%, followed by Lenin, followed by Pushkin, then Peter the Great, and then Putin, with the only non-Russians in a list of 20 being Einstein, Napoleon, and Hitler. Most recently, another May 2021 Yevada poll that asked the question, was Stalin a great leader? 56% either fully agreed or mostly agreed, and only 14% fully or mostly disagreed. What does this signify? Do people yearn for a return to the Stalin era? In a 2019 interview, Lyov Gudkov, who's the director of the Levada polling agency, the one independent polling agency in Russia, asserted that when people are asked whether they would vote for Stalin if you were running for president and whether they would like to have lived during the Stalin era, you get a resounding no. Indeed, any nostalgia for the Soviet period is for the Brezhnev era, when the USSR was a superpower, was feared, was respected. Stalin, of course, as Mark and Norman pointed out, represents the victory in the Great Patriotic War. And please note that a cult of the victory, pure and simple, has long since replaced the earlier and more nuanced and variegated cult of the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet period. It's reflected, of course, in the renaming of the Museum of the Great Patriotic War to the Museum of the Victory. And with this idea that Stalin represents the victory is the idea on the part of really probably quite a few people that Stalin's brutal measures in the 1930s that Norman just outlined for us, and brutal measures during the war as well, had been necessary for achieving the victory. Великое дело без крови не может быть. Without bloodshed, you can't have achieve any great deeds. Stalin represents, and I thank my colleague Masha Lipman for this reminder, also a leader who, like Lenin, had modest tastes, walked around in old shoes and simple clothing. But we really shouldn't overdo either the people's or the regime's admiration of Stalin. Masha Lipman, who has done some excellent work on Russian monuments, also pointed out that any new monuments to Stalin, first of all, are not full-size statues, they're busts, and they're all the work of local communists or local officials. So Norman, it wasn't Putin who sort of ordered the construction of that new bust in Volgograd. It was the local officials in Volgograd. And Putin did visit Volgograd for the anniversary on February 2nd, but he did not attend the unveiling of the bust, as he had done for the memorial to the victims of Stalinism in 2017. I should also note that on this occasion, 2/3 of the population of Volgograd voted against the permanent renaming of their city back to Stalingrad. So Stalin represents order, порядок. In fact, he also, I think it's also important to note that I think the admiration of Stalin implies a criticism of Putin and the current leadership, because they can't measure up. Stalin was treated as an equal by Churchill and Roosevelt. Putin will never be treated by Western leaders as anything but a pariah. Putin is respected by many Russians, but he's not the object of a cult, as was Stalin, certainly not anything to the same extent. Stalin represents for people also the USSR's emergence as a superpower, with the Sovietization of Eastern Europe and Central Europe as a nuclear power. Stalin represents Великий государственник, the state builder, in a country in which having a strong state and being a great power is truly important to many. The question is, what, if any, is the relationship between the high approval ratings of Stalin, of Putin, and the war of Ukraine, and the war in Ukraine? They all represent the determination that Russia must be a great power. They all represent a victory, either achieved or on its way to being achieved. And perhaps this question might be answered more fully in discussion. It's a tough one. As a conclusion, I think you will like this. I'm going to take a moment to speculate on, I guess, another joyous occasion, the death of Putin. What's going to happen if Putin dies in office, which I hope he does? He will have ruled for about the same quarter century or 30 years as Stalin. Will there be long lines to view his body in the Hall of Columns? Probably. Will the narod, the people, feel helpless and lost and weep uncontrollably? Unlikely. I assume he would be buried in the Federal Military Memorial Cemetery that opened in 2013 for the elite in government and military on the northeast outskirts of Moscow. Putin had authorized its construction back in 2001, and it opened in 2013. One of the first prominent members to be buried there was Kalashnikov. It was renamed, interestingly, by the Ministry of Defense in 2021 from the Federal Military Memorial Cemetery to the Federal Military Memorial Pantheon of the Defenders of the Fatherland. So, unless Putin dies in disgrace, he will get to be buried in a pantheon. And Stalin, who was supposed to have been buried in a pantheon, never got to achieve that goal. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nina. Let me turn next to George. Please, George.
Yeah, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here with you. Nina, your opening vignette reminded me of a story my mom told me. She was a schoolgirl at the time in Poland, and she is a nervous laugher. So she actually started laughing in school when Stalin's death was announced and got into quite a bit of trouble, apparently. Unlike my distinguished colleagues, I'm not a historian by training, but I'm rather a political scientist who's interested in how this legacy of Stalin reverberates in contemporary politics, both in Russia and across the wider post-Soviet and post-communist world. I'll share some survey data with you and some trends over time I don't run over too much, but I wanted to briefly set the stage for what's been happening politically in post-Soviet Russia over the last 3+ decades. In the 1990s, Stalin was remembered in Russian society in a myriad of ways, but much of the reaction was negative or leaned negative. And this held true politically as well at the time. I'll remind you that the human rights group Memorial was set up in early 1989 while the Soviet Union was still in existence. And a major focus of Memorial was its efforts to document the crimes of Stalinism and to publicize the names of the victims of Soviet repression, particularly during the 1930s. For many Russians, this really was the first time they'd been exposed to a full-scale accounting of the crimes that were committed by Stalin and his henchmen. I'll also remind you that Memorial was closed by a Russian court order in December of 2021. In the roughly 3 decades that it officially existed, Russian political and societal attitudes towards Stalin changed markedly. And here, I think it's worth noting that the seminar that we're all participating in today is being held just 3 days after the death of Gleb Pavlovsky, the self-styled political technologist who did a great deal to make Putin who he is today and to cement Russia's euphemistically named managed democracy and power vertical that surround the Russian president. And the reason I mention Pavlovsky is that he, after becoming a critic of the Kremlin post-2011, was surprisingly candid about how Putin learned to manipulate facts to serve his political goals. And this includes, very much so, manipulating the memory of Stalin. We see this, for example, in Putin's very pliable attitude toward the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Just to give you some examples of this, in an August 2009 article, Putin openly termed the agreement immoral. But in 2015, against this backdrop of the West condemning the seizure of Crimea and supporting the imposition of sanctions on Russia after events in Ukraine, he defended the USSR's ratification of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a pragmatic accommodation, as he put it, that Stalin was forced to make in order to ensure the Soviet Union's security. And by 2019, Putin had shifted from defending the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to engaging in full-on whataboutism, claiming that Russia's neighbor Poland actually bore a significant responsibility for their outbreak of World War II because Poland had annexed a small piece of Czechoslovakia after the conclusion of the 1938 Munich Agreement, which allowed Hitler to take control of the Sudetenland, of course. I'll just note that Warsaw was not a signatory to this document, and actually in 2009, President Lech Kaczynski at the time apologized for Poland's actions. But what I'm driving at here is that in making this argument, the Russian president was pretty transparently seeking to obfuscate the role that Stalin played in appeasing Hitler by attempting to shift the blame elsewhere. Now, his actions are maybe not all that surprising when we think about the fact that earlier that same fall, so in the fall of 2019, the EU, the European Union, had passed a symbolic resolution championed and really pushed by Polish politicians that assigned co-responsibility to Stalin's USSR and Hitler's Germany for the outbreak of World War II. So how outside actors depict Stalin has actually been a running theme in the development of post-Soviet Russia's largely reactive memory politics. For instance, we see this in how Russia reacted after the Baltic states and 5 former Warsaw Pact countries acceded to the European Union in May of 2004. Once these states were safely ensconced within the EU and had a wide institutional stage from which to make their demands heard, they did just that. Nationalistically minded politicians in countries like Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Czechia began to push to have the crimes of Stalinism recognized as being equal to or commensurate with those of Nazism. Moreover, the political narrative in Eastern and Central Europe increasingly came to be about how the Red Army did not so much represent a liberating force in World War II, so much as one occupier replacing another occupier. This idea of what the French historian Francois Furet called the totalitarian twins of Nazism and Stalinism actually gained a fair amount of traction in Europe at that time. And we see evidence of this in the fact that in 2008, the European Parliament designated August 23rd, the date that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. It's now known as Black Ribbon Day, as a day of remembrance for the victims of Stalinism and Nazism. While in 2009, so a year later, the OSCE's Vilnius Declaration effectively put an equal sign between the crimes of Stalin and Hitler. This and similar developments set off a hugely negative reaction in Russia, and it led directly to the passage of Russia's 2014 so-called Law Against the Rehabilitation of Nazism, which, among other things, criminalized criticizing the wartime actions of the Red Army or the Soviet Union. Irina Yarovaya, the bill's principal sponsor, primary sponsor, characterized this law as a means through which to combat historical falsifications. And since then, several other similar laws have actually been passed. And there's been an amendment to the Constitution talking about defending historical truth, at least historical truth, the way the Kremlin today sees it. Among other things, all of these developments have made it impossible to criticize any of the Red Army's actions in World War II from a legal standpoint, including, as Norman very rightly pointed out, the mass rapes and other crimes against civilians that soldiers committed marching on Berlin. By the way, if anyone's interested in reading a very poignant account of this, I would recommend reading Solzhenitsyn's famous long-form poem, Prussian Nights. He has a very haunting line in there that reads, a girl made into a woman made into a corpse. But this idea of the West and the former Warsaw Pact states engaging in historical falsification has become a common refrain in Russian foreign policy and a common complaint heard. But how Russian politicians relate to Stalin domestically is actually quite complicated. For one thing, the recall of the victory in World War II has, over the course of the last 2 decades, been transformed into what Thomas Sherlock was already labeling in 2009 the central legitimating myth of the Russian state. While in the 1990s, the memory of World War II was still largely a somber event in how it was publicly depicted, by the 2000s Victory Day, which is marked on May 9th, was transformed into something a lot more festive and grandiose. It went largely from focusing on the victims of the war and the tremendous suffering that the Soviet people experienced to being more of a showcase for the might of the Russian state. Victory Day parades on Red Square were not even held annually until after 1995, but by the 2000s, they'd become the key feature of the state's commemorative calendar, a sort of civil religious holy holiday for the Russian state. This, of course, really complicated the memory of Stalin. If the Soviet victory in World War II was the central event in the 20th century history of the Soviet Union and, by extension, Russia, if it was the one event that all Russians could and should be proud of, how can the leader of the country at that time be regarded in an entirely negative light? It makes it quite difficult. By the way, here there's an interesting resonance with Russia's current war in Ukraine. I recall very clearly seeing a woman being asked on Russian television. This was in late February of last year, before the draconian media laws were passed in March, whether Russia was the aggressor in Ukraine. And I remember her answer very clearly. It just really hit me. Without hesitation, she replied that obviously the Russians could not possibly be the aggressors in Ukraine. They were, after all, the heroes of World War II. How could they possibly become the bad guys now? Which I suppose just goes to show you the long-term value of inculcating uncritical historical propaganda in a population. But it's also worth mentioning that the current regime has not entirely whitewashed Stalin's crimes, despite the fact that they're significantly downplayed today, particularly in the educational system, where school textbooks depict Stalin basically as a capable manager and modernizer who committed some excesses along the way. The Gulag and all of the murders that were committed in his name are largely relegated to a footnote. And if we think about it, though, it's actually politically quite useful for the regime not to be too clear in its historical interpretations. So consequently, the current historical narrative, the official narrative, such as it is this really inchoate hodgepodge of Tsarist and Soviet themes. Again, as was pointed out, not so much focusing on the Bolsheviks, but more on the Stalinist period and the victory in World War II. And all of this is overlaid with this Russian Orthodox imagery. It's not a conceptually coherent narrative, but here's the thing, it's not meant to be a conceptually coherent narrative. As the historian Nikolai Kaposov once remarked, it allows everyone to season their interpretation of the past to taste. So if you want to focus on the grandeur of the Tsarist period in today's Russia, you can do that. And if you want to focus on Stalin as a great and wise leader, you can do that as well. Surprisingly, I've been more succinct than I usually am in my comments. So with your permission, I'd like to show you a couple of slides, well, a few slides, just to show this change over time and to show you some differences between how Ukrainians and Russians regard Stalin. So hopefully this will work. Okay, so can people see the slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so the first slide is the one that I think Nina was referring to in her talk. And you see basically the red and the orange are signaling more agreement that Stalin was a great leader. And you see just how greatly that has increased over time. And similarly, the light blue and the dark blue are signaling people who disagree with that. And that has decreased over time. So in April of '92, you see Stalin was regarded in a more negative light than in a positive light. In March of 2016, you see this had changed quite a bit. And then by May of 2021, the Levada Center poll shows that this had really changed quite dramatically. And the vast majority of people, so 56%, were thinking of Stalin in entirely positive or largely positive terms. We see, and I apologize, I didn't get a chance to translate these, so you're seeing the Russian, but you see how do you personally think about Stalin? And here the comparison is between Russia, which is the blue, and Ukraine, which is the yellow. And again, the top most categories are positive and the bottom most are negative. And you see that Ukrainians tend to lean a lot more negative in their assessment. And the Russian part of the survey here was conducted in May of 2021 and the Ukrainian in June of 2021. And here we're actually going to see some English language results. And I thank my colleague Felix Kravatsik at Zeus Berlin for visualizing this. This was a survey that he and I conducted. It had to be online due to the COVID pandemic, but this was conducted in January of 2021. And here we see an assessment of Stalin's role. This was a nationally representative survey. We see that only 22% think that Stalin was directly to blame for the deaths of millions of innocent people in Russia, whereas a smidge over 52% think that Stalin may have made some mistakes, but he has more merit than disadvantages. So please take a mental snapshot of this image and compare it to the next one, which was done in the same time period. So again, January of 2021, but in Ukraine. The contrast could not be starker. Over 60%, nearly 61% of Ukrainians reported that Stalin was directly to blame for the death of millions of innocent people, and under 20% thought that he may have made some mistakes, but has more merit than disadvantages. And I think with that, I'm going to stop there, Mark.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, George. I'm surprised that in Ukraine, it's not even more negative, to be honest. But
well, this was 2021. I mean, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I know. I realize that, but even so, I'm a little surprised. Again, it may account for differences in, between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. But in any case, I just want to touch on a few things. A couple of these are in reaction to what my colleagues here have said. One is Putin does not go around in a military uniform, but Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu does, even though he never served a day in the military. He goes around in an army general's uniform, and I think looks quite ridiculous. He's a career bureaucrat, an incompetent bureaucrat, and it's reflected in the way the war has been conducted. But he everywhere he goes, he appears in the military uniform. With regard to the athletic and physical feats that Putin emphasizes, that is, as Norman mentioned, not really doesn't really harken back to Stalin. It does, however, to Mussolini. And there are some of the when Norman raised the question about fascism, you can definitely see elements of fascism, the classical fascism in Italy, in the way Putin conducts himself, and Putin doesn't, I think, consciously do that, but certainly it's there. Maybe he does do it consciously. So with regard to again, another thing that my colleagues have mentioned, that this cult of death and destruction that has taken root in Russia during the war is so disgusting and unnerving about the way the country is being turned into something that I wish had never happened. But you can see that in, as Norman mentioned, the way that Putin shows utter disregard for the expenditure of soldiers' lives. That was done not only during the war against Germany, but also the war against Finland. Later on, with regard to the Korean War, where Stalin was perfectly happy to expend North Korean and Chinese lives and continue to drag on the war, even though there were many who wanted to reach a ceasefire as early as 1951, but Stalin insisted on continuing the war, and it was only after his death that the real move came to settle the war. And in fact, the ceasefire was the 70th anniversary of that is coming up in July of this year, and that was a direct result of Stalin's death. So one of the issues that I've always puzzled over in thinking about Stalin, and I've looked to Steve Kotkin's biography, and he certainly addresses this issue, but still I don't think really explains it fully, is Stalin's longevity in office, that he managed to stay in office and die a natural death, even though he was manifestly destructive to all those around him who potentially could have removed him. Now, Putin does kill people on occasion through poisoning and throwing them out of windows or having them somehow mysteriously fall out of windows, but it's on a relatively small scale. In Stalin's case, it wasn't on a small scale. It was millions, and that's something that still to me is puzzling, that someone who could cause so much bloodshed could still stay in office. And it wasn't just bloodshed. I mean, the Great Terror was primarily directed against non-communists. The 16-month period in which 800,000 people were killed and were shot to death in 1937 and 1938. But a lot of Stalin's violence was directed against those who potentially could have moved against him. His Communist Party colleagues, the Soviet Army, the NKVD, and other organs that, again, could have marshaled some sort of effort to get rid of him. What is quite striking, though, in looking back at Stalin, is the way he was able to establish a system that left him secure in office. And that's what Putin also seems to have done, much as I would like to see him removed or potentially gotten rid of through other means. He has established a system that makes it very difficult to remove him, to pose a threat to him, multiple layers of security and informants that potentially would be able to find out about any sort of plot against him, and other such things. That's why I think that those who argue that this war may lead to a move against him, it's it's not to say I would wholly rule it out, but it's again a very difficult thing to bring off. What's also interesting, though, is that despite Stalin's lengthy term in office, shortly after he died, the Soviet Union began moving quite significantly away from measures that had been hallmarks of his rule, violent terror, for example, and the kinds of extreme coercion that he used. Again, the Soviet Union remained a repugnant dictatorship and repressive system, but it never returned to the kind of indiscriminate violence that had been there during the Stalin period. So it did illustrate, given how quickly that happened, it did illustrate there were many of those around Stalin who knew what was going on was awful, yet again, they did not dare to move against him. And that's all the more when I look back at that, I can see in Putin's case, he's certainly causing a great deal of destruction during this war, especially to the Ukrainians. But there hasn't been anything like the scale of terror and bloodshed that Stalin carried out. So let me also say that Stalin's use of wars and his disregard for human life was not just the external wars, it was also the war that he waged against the peasantry in the Soviet Union. Now, he wasn't alone in despising the peasantry. Many of the top Bolsheviks did. But still, his cruelty and his utter lack of compassion for the millions who were killed as a direct result of his policy still is frightening to look back on. So let me, because I want to leave time for questions from the audience, let me just say one last thing in thinking about the data that George has discussed is Russians certainly can learn an enormous amount about Stalin's crimes. Even now, they can go onto the internet and learn about what he did. But it reminds me of something that, but so many don't want to or aren't interested in learning about it. That's why in some of the data, the Stalin that they were talking about is the Stalin who was in office during the Second World War. And it's not probably the Stalin during the Great Terror or the vicious anti-Semitic campaign after the war. The Stalin, though, that many in Russia nowadays are thinking of is one of the kind of image that Putin wants to convey. And the troubling aspect of that is that there is a great deal more that comes with Stalin, and I'm worried that potentially that others will use that in Russia to bring about an even worse system than exists now. There's been a major return to Soviet-style repression during the war, but I still worry that it's going to get much worse. So with that optimistic note, I will turn to questions from the audience. I'm not sure that I have. So there are no, okay, so let me ask if any of the panelists would like to offer comments based on what you've heard. Please, Norman.
So we're going to talk now?
Yeah, you can offer any
Okay, just
brief comments.
just a couple of things that struck me, Mark. I mean, I agree with your Mussolini statement, especially the sort of bearing of the chest is very Mussolini-like, and the this masculine image that Putin portrays. I think your question about how he managed to stay in office such a long time, and by the way, how Putin is staying in office also a long time, is a good question, and it's one that I would suggest, maybe has something to do with, I mean, we know your political science training when you say system, right? That there's a system involved. There's also something that's harder to deal with. And you remember in the old days, Ned Keenan used to talk about, the political culture of the Kremlin and what goes on there. And there is a kind of, political culture at work. I mean, I wouldn't know how necessarily to attack this in a scholarly book or article, but there, when let's compare Putin. When you compare Putin and Stalin, certainly the longevity is part of the story, and what that means is an ability, within this sort of general culture, which does not somehow think about the need to change leaders at elections or every once in a while, that within this culture there is the possibility of simply sidelining any potential rivals, and that's what they both did. Any potential. I mean, they sidelined them in different ways, but nevertheless they were sidelined. And some of them, many of them, are abroad now. You think about these 500,000 people or so, we don't know exactly, let's say 500,000 Russians who have fled abroad. Well, in the Soviet days, they wouldn't let them flee abroad, right? They couldn't flee abroad, so they were still there and may have had to have been killed, in other words, many of them. And in this case, we have a whole series of groups of opponents. I mean, they come through Harvard, I'm sure, just as they come through Stanford, who are, working to overthrow the present government. But it's hard to do in immigration, just like it was hard to do in the 19th century, to do it from abroad. So I think there's something deeper at work, than a kind of system of government in both cases. I think there's continuities and cultural views of leadership, and how leaders view the country and how the country views their leaders. And like I said, I wouldn't know how to go at that exactly, but I remember that quite brilliant article by Keenan about the Kremlin.
Yeah, Muscovite folkways. Nina?
Yes. Well, you raised the question, about sort of what next. I mean, does Putin have such staying power? So many people are sort of hoping that there will be some kind of breakup, crack up. Of course, that's what Putin is saying. I was thinking, as an historian, and speaking of Keenan, studying with him about medieval Russia, the question is Russia going through its fourth time of troubles? The Smuta, the time of troubles. The first was 1598 to 1613, with the end of the Rurikid dynasty. And there was a collapse of statehood. Russia was depopulated, invaded, and it led to the development of robust Muscovite absolutism, to state building. The second time of troubles was 1918 to 21, the time of the Civil War, with depopulation, devastation, the typhus and influenza pandemic, the Great Famine of 1920-21, which gradually eventually led to the state building by Stalin. And the third was the 1990s, culminating in the collapse of the ruble in 1998 and the Putin era, and the gradual restoration of the vertikal vlasti, the vertical of power, Putin state building. And with this war, are we looking at perhaps a fourth? If Russia continues to do badly, what will be the effect on Russian statehood? will, as Mark says, will the system really be able to endure? So I think that's just a question to consider and look at a big picture with this pattern of then collapse, sort of overreach, collapse, and then state building. I think it was maybe Hosking in his textbook talked about centuries and centuries long pattern in Russian history of the acquisition of lands, then overreach, and then collapse and rebuilding, with the last one presumably being the overreach territorially, being the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, and then ultimately the collapse of the end of the Soviet Union, which just couldn't manage this huge empire. So just posing some big questions here. And I do appreciate what colleagues have to say about looking at Stalin and Putin. I myself, from the get-go, have also thought about the comparison with Mussolini, Mark, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Thank you, Nina. George.
Yeah, so really interesting points. Of course, this discussion about whether the current Russian system has resonances with fascism of the type embodied by Benito Mussolini has been going on for a while now. It is interesting to think about that both the fascists and the Bolsheviks kind of fetishized both the cult of masculinity and the cult of violence. I'm not sure I'm ready to weigh in on the side of it is a fascist type regime, but it is interesting to think about that. Norman, you mentioned political scientists and our predilection to talk about systems. Well, the Russian elites also talk about the sistema that was established. But speaking of these wider implications, I think about what this might mean for the Russian state. But I also wonder how, if Russia continues to do so badly, how this might embolden other non-democratic, non-liberal powers around it. I mean, the big one, of course, to think about is China, which you can be guaranteed is watching the progression of what's going on in Ukraine with a lot of interest. In response to Mark's question about comment about the surveys, yeah, Mark, we see a huge difference in the Ukrainian component of the survey, whether the survey, and we gave people who took the survey the chance to answer it in Russian or Ukrainian. There's a huge difference among people who answered the survey in Russian versus those who answered in Ukrainian. However, I do want to say this, that one other thing we found that is worth mentioning, we discovered that just because you are a Russian speaker in Ukraine doesn't mean you necessarily support the policies of the Kremlin. And I think that's a really important distinction that needs to be made.
Sure, absolutely. Just a couple of quick things I had meant to mention earlier is the way, going back to this cult of death now in Russia, is one of the phrases used at the Luzhniki rally was a soldier who was giving a rap song in which he said, "I'm proud of shedding blood and getting it up to my shedding blood up to my elbows." That very phrase was used by Nikita Khrushchev toward the end of his life, when he was asked about his role during the Stalin era, and he said it in sorrow and shame that. His elbows were covered with blood, his elbows and up to his elbows in blood. And so for Khrushchev, it was a mark of shame and sorrow. For Putin and those around him, it has become a mark of pride and glory, which again is quite probably something that Stalin would have approved of, although he didn't use it in quite those terms, but certainly said many things similar, talking about exterminating the kulaks and the like. But there was something, and this again goes back to what George was discussing, is Alexander Yakovlev, the senior aide to Gorbachev, and the one who had a great deal of influence in the first 5 years of Gorbachev's time in office, in a bold reformer, Later on, after the Soviet Union broke apart, Yakovlev set up a foundation that collected and declassified documents, a great number of documents about the Stalinist terror. And in, I think it was January of 2001, I was speaking with him. I had gone to the Yakovlev Foundation. And I remember he said to me, I think I can quote it word for word, is that when I look at all of these documents and see the terrible cruelty that people had toward one another and ordered from the top, from Stalin, that it terrifies me. But then he said, but what terrifies me even more is that the vast majority of people in this country, meaning Russia, are totally indifferent to this information. So the problem in weighing people's views of Stalin nowadays is that they are willfully ignorant, I think, of a lot of Stalin's crimes. It's not to say, it is taught to a degree in schools, but, in a very whitewashed way. And it's really unfortunate, I think, that this war is deepening that whole trend toward whitewash, or that whole policy of whitewashing. Given that Stalin, is seen now, all of the things that Norman was discussing, is it's going to make it even more difficult for people to have a truly accurate conception of what Stalin was. And that's why in the polls now, I think up to 2021, I think it's it's reasonable to look on them. From 2022 on, I think it's going to be very hard to say that people are thinking of Stalin as a criminal. They're going to be thinking of Stalin as a glorious leader. And so it'll be much more difficult to weigh trends. And thinking back to what Yakovlev said at that point, I think that itself is a terrifying thing for Russia.
So, Mark, if I can, there's also a question in the Q&A that relates to what you were saying, which is, is the passing of the generation that experienced the crimes of Stalin the reason why now people are more ready to look positively at it. And I would suggest everything you say struck me as right. But I would suggest in response to that question too. Well, let me have two responses. One, the war itself, as you indicated, I think has made things much more difficult for an honest evaluation of Stalin for precisely the reasons you were talking about. I mean, the whole point of my talk, when I sat down to do it, I realized that I think much differently about this now than I thought about it, the same question 4 or 5 years ago, or even 2, 3 years ago. I mean, the war has changed a lot in Russia, and it's changed a lot about how Putin has acted too. And it's accelerated a lot of trends that were there before. But, war always does this thing. Does this kind of acceleration, intensification effect. And if it goes on too much longer, I think you're absolutely right that it's going to get even more difficult. And the cult of Stalin, and that's not necessarily cult of Stalin, but the positive evaluations of Stalin will become even more positive as time goes on. The other thing I wanted to say in response to that question, which is a great question, is that no, I don't think the change of generations is what's at work. In other words, we find, and it's kind of an extraordinary phenomenon, that many people who went through the Stalin period have nostalgia for it and think positively about it. I mean, there's this film that was done here actually at Stanford. Paul Gregory did this film called Women in the Gulag or something like that. And Catherine Jollak did some work on women in the Gulag who were interviewed. And the interviews are basically everything's fine with Stalin, right? And even some of them say the Gulag, was okay. But there's this kind of sense of, a positive memory of the Stalin period that is really pervasive among large numbers of the older people who had gone through this experience. So what's happening now, I think, is absolutely right. That Mark is right. It's related, to Putin, to the war, to state power, to the propaganda on television, and to the way Russia and the Kremlin is presenting itself to the world now, which is sort of Stalin era reverberates in it. And then there's this business again of the secret police. I was very impressed by Soldatov's, investigative reporting, where he's talking about the way the secret police are working and how they're able to manipulate affairs, in such a way that the Russian people will be, positively impressed by the Russian actions at war in Ukraine, and how the Ukrainians are portrayed too. I mean, it's the war again. This whole Nazi business. It's not a joke, right? It's serious business that they're turning Ukrainians into Nazis, which of course they're not. I mean, it's fully nonsense. And the result is, a kind of reliving in some ways of the Great Patriotic War through the lenses, the Kremlin today.
Yeah, if I could respond as well. I also agree, Norman, that I think it's not the February memory of Stalin in fact, it's much more pronounced among the older people and much less pronounced among the younger people. But it's also true, right? And it's also true that the younger people don't know much about Stalin. And don't know much about the Stalin era. In 2020, this blogger Yuri Dudz made a quite a popular film. I think they have 14 millions and millions of people saw it, about Coloma. And it was in response to having read about how young people don't know about the 1930s.
Yeah.
Right. So I think all of that, really is very, very telling, that the difference in generations. Plus, even if you look at more recent poll figures during the war, young people are more likely to not want to pay attention to it. They're the ones who say they don't even want to know about it. Although, of course, they got scared with the mobilization. But I agree with all of you. Everything has changed in this war. And all of the poll figures we're looking at, of course, except for the approval ratings of the war and of Putin, predate the invasion of February 22. So we don't know as much about what people think about Stalin right now in 2023, but we certainly know what they think about Putin, with his approval rating is up to 83% as of February. Yeah.
Please, George.
Just very quickly, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of it has to do with how young people are taught in schools and how they relate to, or don't relate, maybe, is really the key factor here to the memory of Stalin. But this cognitive dissonance goes back a long way. I mean, I remember the first trip I took to Russia in 2003. I befriended a cab driver in Irkutsk, and we kind of spent a few days together. One of the things he did was drove me out to the countryside, and he showed me these, bratskие могилы, these mass graves. And his comment was, I have relatives buried in here. And that got us off on a discussion about Stalin. And his second comment was, but Stalin was a great man because he increased the status of the state. And I've been, frankly, struggling with that, to fully understand that ever since. I think one thing, though, that's interesting about the war, this push on Nazis, and of course, the Russians understand Nazis differently than we in the West understand Nazis, to some extent. To them, it's fascism. To them, it's those who would want to harm Russia. It's not necessarily those who perpetrated the Holocaust and so forth. But it makes this interesting rhetorical link to allow the soldiers that perish now in this war to somehow be linked to their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers who perished in the Second World War. And I think from a propaganda standpoint, that's just kind of a brilliant connection that I don't know whether they did this consciously or not, but the connection is there nonetheless.
I find it, on that very issue, George, I find it frightening the way, say, Patriarch Kirill and others have argued to young soldiers, that they are, or as Kirill put it, that that if they die in war, all their sins will be atoned for. And other ways of trying to get people to look forward to death, not, in other words, it's this kind of exaltation of death. It's more than just a cult of death. It's really this sickening way of trying to promote a willingness to die, not only a willingness, but even eagerness to die. And that's also reflected in the comments by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, in telling recruits that yes, they're likely to die, but that will be better. They'll no longer be regarded as criminals. They'll be regarded as glorious soldiers. And other ways of trying to promote that notion that I just find very troubling about Russia, the way it's changed during the war. And you can see some of that again in the Soviet Union during Stalin's time, certainly during the Second World War. But and then one last point with regard to the Nazis. I mean, it's a ludicrous the way that that allegation has been put forward. It's a ludicrous distortion of what happened during the Maidan Revolution. There were far-right groups that took part in the Maidan Revolution, but then afterward, and again, I was worried for a little while that they might gain prominence in post-Maidan Ukraine, but they didn't. They did miserably. They basically faded from the scene. And it's not to say that there aren't still some elements around, but they certainly did not become politically significant. And so that's why it's all the more dispiriting to see the way that that term and that image has been manipulated to try to convince Russians that they're just it's just a redo of the Second World War.
But Mark, some of this is earlier. So frequently when I've asked people that I've worked with on the right now on images of the war, what do you mean by what does it mean to be a patriot? They say the willingness to die for your country.
Well, I mean, that's there's some merit to that. That's a fairly benign conception. It's different to say that I'm eager to go die for, that I somehow will have my sins atoned for.
Yeah, well, that's it's off the charts. Yeah, it's outrageous.
But the way Wagner, the Wagner group, the criminals in the Wagner group are told that they'll no longer be looked on as criminals; they'll be looked on as heroes. George?
No, I was just quickly going to say, two comments. You're absolutely right. So in the 2019 parliamentary election, the PR component of it in Ukraine, the far-right groups had to run as a bloc, and they only got a hair over 2% of the votes, so they didn't even cross the electoral threshold. But Stalin has, this tie to religion is an interesting one because Stalin's really been reimagined. Putin has become a cultural warrior, but I think what a lot of people still don't understand, that's not ideology, if we can call it that, of his own making. Kirill was a cultural warrior way before Putin was. And in many ways, this is kind of a fusion of convenience. And Stalin has, in church circles, still fringe, but it's there, been reimagined as this kind of moral figure, this kind of morally upright figure. And on the real fringes, this is not at all a mainstream representation of orthodoxy, but you even have people who kind of consider him as a saintly figure. You can find icons painted of Stalin with the nimbus around his head and so forth. So
Sure.
the cultural component of this is really interesting, and how Stalin's been reimagined in this new ideology of the state.
Yeah, Stalin is a brand, a brand.
Yeah, maybe we'll figure in advertising for Louis Vuitton. But let me, each panelist will get 1 minute to say final words. So please, Norman. Norman, you're muted. Norman, you're still muted.
Okay.
Okay.
A final word, that's a hard one at this point. Let me just say that let me repeat in some ways or summarize, my thoughts about this, and that is that, again, the war has intensified all kinds of trends that were already underway, but it's intensified them in such a way that, Russia is becoming a country that in some ways is unrecognizable, at least from the period 4 or 5 years ago, only 4 or 5 years ago. It's become something else. And that's a really scary proposition. On the other hand, by the way, when you think about Ukraine, it's also becoming a different country as a result of this war. It's becoming much more unified. It's becoming much more nationally conscious. It's becoming much more Ukrainian in some ways. Ukraine has been created in some ways by this war, but there's a new Russia that's being built that I find scary. And let me leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Nina?
Yes. Well, I think that what we have to take a look at is really look more at the cultural aspects that George was just talking about. The Russian Orthodox Church actually has promoted a cult of Stalin, as you say, icons with his image. And so I think that we have to see that in this period of war, that we do see perhaps the legacy of Stalin connecting with the high approval ratings of the war, with people's willingness to go and fight and die, with people's willingness to do what the regime tells them to do, with people's willingness to just believe lies. That comes from the Stalin era, I think. So I think we should, if we want to say that Putin is no Stalin, although he's getting to resemble him more and more, that the legacy of Stalin and Stalinism in the mindset of many Russian people does live on, sadly.
George?
I agree wholeheartedly. I think the propaganda coming back in the way it has is what's most redolent of Stalinism. But something, my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people, as I'm sure all of ours do. But Putin, in trying to emulate a great leader, whether it be Stalin or Peter the Great, has proven himself to be inept and unconvincing. I mean, I think Putin's legacy is going to be, he's the guy who lost Ukraine for Russia forever. And I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. In many ways, seizing Crimea, for example, removed 2 million voters from Ukraine that had voted for tended to vote for pro-Russian candidates. There will never be a pro-Russian government in Ukraine again, even if this war weren't happening. And through other actions that Putin has taken over the last 9 years, as Norman mentioned, that modern Ukraine, that is the current day Ukraine, didn't really exist until this war. It was beginning to coalesce, but it wasn't really there until this war. This war is making Ukraine probably for the better. I think on the whole for the better. It's not always good to be bred in war, but I think in this case, at least, we can be quite optimistic about Ukraine. With regard to Russia, though, I see no basis for any kind of optimism. Having said that, where I'll end is that this Sunday, when Stalin, the 70 years ago, this Sunday, when Stalin died, many people in the Soviet Union and some outside, but particularly in the Soviet Union, worried that there was going to be a worse regime coming to power. But in fact, fortunately, that didn't happen. The change was certainly nowhere near significant enough, but it did. The Soviet Union did change. It didn't return to the worst crimes of the Stalin era. And for a brief while, there were even, the anti-Semitic campaign ended and other forms of viciousness in the final years of Stalin's life. So I'm just hoping that at some point, if this war proves to be a disastrous failure for Putin, that it may help in bringing an end to the return to a kind of tyranny over the last year. So with that, let me thank Norman, Nina, and George. Let me also thank Hiro Kuromiya, who had intended to be here, but and also Laura Sargent, who arranged today's seminar, and all of the audience who were able to watch. So with that, we will adjourn.